Hello from the Authors Guild Foundation. We're here to discuss academic freedom in hostile times with Michael DeCesare of the American Association of University Professors, the Professors Guild in a sense. The Authors Guild Foundation is the charitable arm of the Authors Guild, a professional membership association of some 13,000 authors. Our members get legal advice and other services from us, but the foundation as a charity is here to support and protect all U.S. writers by protecting free speech, copyright, ensuring that writers can get paid for their work and all that sort of thing. So we're always interested in talking about the importance of free expression, which is in the crosshairs politically and culturally these days in higher education. Michael DeCesare is a senior program officer at AAUP in their Department of Academic Freedom, Tenure, and Governance. Prior to joining the AAUP staff, he spent nearly 20 years as a faculty member. And joining us for a conversation is Authors Guild Foundation board member Richard Thompson Ford, a professor of law at Stanford. He writes for scholarly and popular audiences. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Boston Globe, and beyond. And he's written several books, including his most recent Dress Codes, How the Laws of Fashion Made History. Well, let's get to the talk. We want to hear all about AAUP and what's going on in the world now. Richard, I'll turn it to you.
Great, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this very timely, always timely, but especially timely in today's environment, this topic of academic freedom. I've been a professor at Stanford for many years and have seen many of the ups and downs around this issue. And it's quite clear that we're currently in a time where there's a great deal of pressure on academic freedom from all sides of the political spectrum, and for a variety of reasons, the freedoms that we've taken for granted for many years are now under a great deal of attack. I'm a member of a group called the Academic Freedom Alliance, and we look to ensure that scholars are not punished for freedom of expression. And this is a group that was formed not that many years ago, but we're doing a lot of work on this front. So at any rate, without further ado, I turn it over to Michael. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Richard, for the introduction and for moderating today's session. Thank you to Johnny and his colleagues at the Authors Guild for organizing this session. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I'd like to thank all of you who are in attendance for this. I'd just like to spend 25-30 minutes on a brief presentation about the AAUP, what we do, who we are, and specifically what academic freedom is about and what it is not, and how tenure is connected to that, and a number of other topics, namely these. First, as I said, what is the AAUP? What is the so-called Redbook? What is academic freedom and what is tenure, and how are those connected to each other? What are some of the current challenges to academic freedom and tenure that we're confronting, not only as a small staff and in the Department of Academic Freedom, Tenure, and Governance, but as a country? And then the final substantive topic is what is the relationship between academic freedom and the faculty's role in institutional decision making, or what we commonly call shared governance? And then where can I learn more? I have a slide with a link to some of the many resources that the AAUP has available online. And I should mention here, I'll try to remember to mention at the end as well, I'll be happy to share this presentation with Johnny for possible disbursement to whoever's in attendance today. So you'll have live links to the various resources that I talk about a little bit later on. This is the AAUP's mission statement. I'm not going to read it to you, of course, but I will point out that the very first part of it says the mission is to advance academic freedom and shared governance. Since the association's founding in 1915, those have been our two primary concerns. Our most important standing committees continue to be Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure, and our Committee on College and University Governance. Those are the two kind of bread and butter issues for us, even after 108 years. We obviously, there are other parts of the mission, as you can see, but the only other thing I would point out from this slide is at the very end. The AAUP is the only national organization in this country that advocate solely for faculty members, higher education faculty members. And in the process of doing that, the association has indeed helped to shape American higher education by developing those principles and standards and procedures that maintain not only the great higher education system we have in this country, but also maintain academic freedom in those colleges and universities. Those standards and procedures and principles that have been developed over more than a century now are pulled together in our AAUP policy documents and reports, what we affectionately refer to as the Redbook for obvious reasons. The Redbook, the current edition of the Redbook contains more than 80 of the AAUP's most useful and important policy documents. This has sections on academic freedom, tenure and due process, faculty governance, professional ethics, etc., as you can see at the bottom of the slide. We anticipate a brand new edition of the Redbook, either next year or in 2025. It will be available again, as the current version is, through Johns Hopkins University Press, for those of you who are interested in having it on your desk, as those of us in the department constantly do. It is our reference book. These are the standards that have defined American higher education for decades. The most important of those policy documents is the 1940 Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom and Tenure. It's the most significant policy document in large part because it represents an agreed upon understanding. The 1940 statement was actually a joint formulation of the AAUP and what is now the American Association of Colleges and Universities, which is an organization essentially of college and university presidents. This, because it's so fundamental, we refer to it in just about every time we write a letter to a college or university president. When we want to remind them of our standards, we reference the 1940 statement. The 1940 statement has been endorsed by more than 250 scholarly societies and higher education organizations. It represents an agreement between a group that represents the faculty and a group that represents administrations about the meaning and purpose of academic freedom and tenure. And that's also a big part of what makes it such a significant document. By our count, by our estimation, it's incorporated in some way in hundreds, maybe as many as 1,000 faculty handbooks and collective bargaining agreements across the country. So what the statement says first is that institutions of higher education are conducted for the common good, and not to further the interest of either the individual teacher or the institution as a whole. And if an institution is indeed going to be conducted for the common good, then there needs to be free search for truth and its expression at that institution. Academic freedom, according to the statement, is essential to these purposes, the purposes being the free search for truth and its expression. And here's also where tenure comes in. Tenure is a means to certain ends, specifically, according to the statement, freedom of teaching and research and of extramural activities, and two, a sufficient degree of economic security to make the profession attractive to people of ability. Tenure was never conceived by the AAUP as some kind of a gold star or sticker for being a great researcher or productive scholar. Tenure instead, as the 1940 statement makes quite clear, tenure is a means to certain ends, one of those ends being academic freedom. That is all tenure was conceived to be 83 years ago. So what is academic freedom exactly? Well, the 1940 statement elaborates. First, teachers are entitled to full freedom in research and in the publication of the results. Both of those are equally important. We sometimes field questions from faculty members asking about their academic freedom in publication. And we always say to them, that is also protected by academic freedom. Not only can you conduct research in the areas that you see fit as a professional, you also are entitled to the freedom to publish the results of that research. 2, teachers are entitled to freedom in the classroom in discussing their subjects. And 3rd, according to the 1940 statement, college and university teachers are citizens and members of a learned profession and officers of an educational institution. But when they speak or write as citizens, they should be free from institutional censorship or discipline. Both on-campus, about on-campus matters and off-campus matters, societal matters, cultural matters. That's not explicit in the 1940 statement. So one of the derivative policy documents, one of the policy documents that derived from the 1940 statement was a report called Protecting an Independent Faculty Voice, Academic Freedom after Garcetti v. Ceballos. And that report made much clearer the argument that academic freedom also extends to what we call intramural speech or intramural expression, namely what's in boldface type here. Academic freedom is the freedom, yes, of course, to teach both in and outside the classroom and to conduct research and to publish the results, but also to address any matter of institutional policy or action, whether or not as a member of an agency of institutional governance. You do not have to be a member of your faculty senate. You do not have to be a member of a faculty committee in order to have the freedom to criticize, to seek revision to institutional policies and procedures. Those rights accrue to you under academic freedom as the AAUP defines it. And then, of course, the extramural speech part, professors should also have the freedom to address the larger community with regard to any matter of social, political, economic, or other interest. And there should not be any discipline or censorship of that intramural or extramural speech. Tenure and academic freedom, as I said, or as I mentioned earlier, I think, are bound together. Why is tenure so important? Because free inquiry, free expression, and open dissent are critical for student learning and the advancement of knowledge and a democratic society. Not to sound too overly dramatic about it, but they are critical to all 3 of those areas. It's crucial to protect academic freedom then, if we want to have student learning and knowledge advancement and a democratic society. And the best way, the means by which, to use the language I used earlier, the means by which to have academic freedom is tenure, overwhelmingly. Tenure serves that purpose. So when we see attacks on tenure, which we have seen consistently since the 1970s, we consider those to also be attacks on academic freedom. Where there is no tenure, there is not academic freedom. Where there is an overwhelming proportion of faculty members who are not eligible for tenure, there is not truly academic freedom. Tenure is there to make sure that academic freedom is also there. So the challenges to academic freedom and tenure go hand in hand. An attack on tenure is an attack on academic freedom. One of the current challenges is just a lack of understanding of the importance of both tenure and academic freedom, a lack of understanding among the general public, a lack of understanding among, I would say, a not insignificant portion of the professoriate itself, and certainly a lack of understanding among politicians, especially as we've seen in recent months. That leads to political interference. One of the manifestations of a lack of understanding of the importance of tenure and academic freedom is increasing political interference in higher education. And I'll talk more about, I'll talk about that now, actually. Kind of Exhibit A, we saw last year, February of 2022, when Texas's lieutenant governor claimed that he will not stand by and let loony Marxist University of Texas professors poison the minds of young students with critical race theory. This quotation and others from Lieutenant Governor Patrick demonstrated an utter misunderstanding of not only who faculty members are, but what they do and their relationship with students. And not to mention his subsequent attacks on tenure, the status of tenure across the public institutions in the state. More recently, of course, Governor DeSantis in Florida, in regard to his quote unquote hostile takeover of New College of Florida, said if you want to do things like gender ideology, go to Berkeley. For us, with our tax dollars, we want to be on the classical mission of what a university is supposed to be. Regrettably, what has happened at New College of Florida with Governor DeSantis's appointment to the governing board of about a half dozen highly partisan trustees has resulted in an exodus of faculty members, including those with tenured and those with tenure and those on the tenure track. And what has replaced those professors are faculty members who are not being offered even tenure track positions. So tenure is being eviscerated at New College of Florida, if only by attrition, as a result of what's happened there since January or February of this year. And that, of course, weakens the climate for academic freedom at the institution. Governor DeSantis, of course, would like to see this kind of spread to other institutions, not only in Florida, but as he has said, across the country. In response to what's going on in Florida in particular, the AAUP's executive director appointed a special committee on to examine academic freedom in Florida, like across the state. Typically, our AAUP investigating committees and special committees have historically focused on institutions, a single institution most typically, but at times several institutions in a single report. This is the first special committee, I believe, that has been charged with examining what's going on in an entire state, both its college and its university system. The special committee issued a preliminary report in May, I believe it was, which concluded that, quote, academic freedom, tenure, and shared governance in Florida's public colleges and universities currently face a politically and ideologically driven assault unparalleled in US history. The authors of the report do not find that to be hyperbole. And if you'd like to read the full preliminary report, I put the link on the slide, and you can judge for yourselves whether it is exaggeration or not. The special committee is continuing its interviews of faculty members, administrators, students, alumni, and plans to issue a full final report sometime early in the fall. So that's something for those of you who are interested in Florida specifically to keep an eye out for. Lack of understanding of academic freedom and tenure and their importance, just kind of blatant political interference from Florida to Texas to Ohio to pretty much, point to a state on the map and you'll see it. Also, the pandemic, COVID-19 represented a significant challenge to academic freedom and tenure. So much so that the AAUP's executive director appointed an investigating committee back in 2020, I believe it was, late 2020, to look into the effect of COVID-19 on academic governance in particular. But what that committee found is not only that the pandemic had really damaged the faculty's role in institutional decision-making at the 8 institutions that were part of the investigation, but the committee also, quote, encountered overwhelming evidence that tenure and therefore academic freedom has faced a frontal assault at these 8 investigated institutions and many others that were not included as part of that investigation in the wake of the pandemic. It's the institution of tenure, the committee's report continued, which serves as the foundation of academic freedom in this country's colleges and universities, has taken a serious hit over the past year, and not only at the institutions under investigation. And again, you can see the link for the full report if you'd like to take a look at it. It is much lengthier, just as a warning, than the Florida Special Committee's preliminary report. So if you're looking for something to read, you might want to start with the Florida Committee's report. The COVID-19 and governance report was issued in May of 2021, I believe it was. But for those of you who are interested in tenure and academic freedom and the faculty's role in institutional decision-making, this report is well worth your time as well. It's worth pointing out that the pandemic is still making its effects felt. We recently released an investigative report of Emporia State University in Kansas, which actually, the administration of which reacted to a board policy that reactivated a COVID era emergency policy that gave presidents of universities in the Kansas system the power to simply dismiss tenured faculty members. And the claim was that it was because of financial stresses brought about by COVID, even though we're now well past the peak of the pandemic and have been for a long time. So the remnants of COVID are definitely still with us. And finally, another current but also ongoing challenge to academic freedom and tenure is the over-reliance for several decades now on non-tenure track faculty. Those faculty members who are not eligible for tenure and likely never will be. And I'm not referring here only to part-time faculty members or who we typically refer to as adjuncts, but also to full-time non-tenure track faculty, a category that we've seen expand in recent decades, especially. Clinical faculty and visiting faculty and, professors of practice. The titles that have proliferated, while creative, have also enlarged the class of full-time non-tenure track faculty members. So what are the best ways to protect tenure and by extension academic freedom? And I wish I had the key to this, the magic words, but first it's faculty acting collectively, whether it's through a formal collective bargaining unit or a faculty senate, or through no formal mechanism, just acting collectively with one another to make their voices and concerns heard by those who need to hear them. Part of acting collectively, of course, is establishing an AAUP chapter where one does not exist. You only need 7 members, 7 dues-paying members to establish a chapter and receive your charter from the national office and get things going. And then, of course, incorporating AAUP policy standards into your faculty handbook, into your collective bargaining agreement is a really important aspect of protecting academic freedom and tenure as well. These policy documents are designed to do exactly that. And we always encourage faculty members to get as much of this into their handbooks and CBAs as they can. Of course, these latter two on this slide go hand in hand. Part of the purpose of having an AAUP chapter on campus is for the chapter to work in collaboration with the Senate or the equivalent faculty governance body to seek the adoption of policy statements on campus in institutional regulations. The most important of which are, again, the 1940 Statement of Principles. As widely incorporated as it is not incorporated into every single handbook in the country, but it's important to work toward that if you don't have it already. It provides the authoritative definitions of key principles that will govern faculty members' professional lives at the institution. It provides definitions that the institution has agreed upon, if not formally endorsed, by incorporating them into the institutional regulations. It recognizes the authority of the AAUP on these matters, of course, And its presence in the faculty handbook also implies that other AAUP standards may be applicable. We have a number of policy statements that have derived from the 1940 statement over the last 83 years. And if the 1940 statement applies, then many of those will also apply. One of which is parts of another policy document called the Recommended Institutional Regulations on Academic Freedom and Tenure. The Recommended Institutional Regulations were designed specifically and written specifically to be incorporated verbatim into an institution's regulations. Those recommended institutional regulations exist as a body to literally be lifted from the Redbook and kind of plopped into your institution's regulations, either all 16 of them together or individual ones, however you want to try and do it. It's good to get them in there. They're also designed to protect tenure and academic freedom, primarily through the dismissal policies that the recommended institutional regulations set forth. The AAUP has long recognized only 3 legitimate bases for terminating a tenured appointment. And I should back up and say, yes, tenured faculty members can be dismissed under AAUP standards. It's a common misunderstanding and mischaracterization, alarmingly common actually, that the AAUP says you can never fire a tenured faculty member. That's simply not true. We do recognize 3 legitimate bases for terminating a tenured appointment. First, dismissal for cause. That's covered by Regulation 5 of the RIRs. A demonstrably bona fide financial exigency, and we define what a financial exigency is in Regulation 4C, and program discontinuance, the discontinuance of an academic program or department for educational reasons as defined by the faculty. Those are the only 3 legitimate bases for terminating a tenured faculty member's appointment. And by setting forth procedures for doing so, the AAUP is protecting tenure. I mean, without these, and without adhering to these procedures, as was the case with Emporia Estates Administration, tenure can't be said to exist. When an administration can simply point to tenured faculty members and say, you and you are done at the end of this year, tenure can't truly be said to exist at that institution. So Regulation 5, before I get to 4C and 4D, lays out the essentials of what dismissal for cause should look like. And what those standards boil down to is a faculty member who the administration is seeking to dismiss for cause is entitled to an administrative hearing of record, an adjudicative hearing of record, before a faculty hearing committee in which the administration bears the burden of proof for demonstrating adequate cause. That's what it boils down to. Regulation 4C is designed to prevent administrations from, again, kind of cherry picking tenured appointments for termination for bogus financial reasons. We anticipate a budgetary shortfall next year, so the following 10 tenured faculty members will no longer be with us effective next month. That's not acceptable under our standards. And the purpose of Regulation 4D is to prevent administrations from terminating tenured appointments for bogus educational reasons. We've gotten a lot of inquiries over the last week from and about West Virginia University and the looming cuts there, the elimination of the entire world languages department, and presumably the termination of all of those faculty appointments and a number of others across campus. The president of the AAUP, Dr. Irene Mulvey, released a statement yesterday or the day before, kind of calling on West Virginia's administration to adhere to precisely the standards that you see on this screen. Her statement references both Regulation 4C and Regulation 4D, and again calls on the administration to observe those standards. And then finally, I would be remiss in any presentation on academic freedom and tenure, if I did not talk about briefly the relationship of academic freedom and the faculty's role in institutional decision making. Another of the statements in the Redbook is on the relationship of faculty governance to academic freedom, and it makes the argument that faculty participation in governance is, quote unquote, arguably inextricably linked to academic freedom. And here's how. Maintaining academic freedom requires the faculty to participate in governance. Think about an appointment, rank, and tenure committee that makes recommendations to the administration about tenure cases and promotion cases. If faculty members are interested in maintaining academic freedom, they have to participate on that committee. There needs to be a faculty committee that essentially makes those decisions if there is to be academic freedom at the institution. If those decisions about promotions and tenure are left in the hands of the administration instead, that opens the door quite wide to violations of academic freedom, to an administrator saying, no, we're not going to tenure that faculty member because they have been too outspoken against the administration. Having the faculty participate instead and make that the judgment in those areas is what maintains academic freedom. On the flip side, or at the same time, the faculty's participation in governance is protected by academic freedom. As I said earlier, that's the intramural expression or intramural speech part. The faculty members individually and collectively have the right under academic freedom protections to be critical of institutional policies and to seek revision of those policies. Academic freedom does not protect a faculty member's right to violate institutional policies, but it does afford them the right to question them and criticize them and seek changes to them. Put those two things together, the best protection of academic freedom and thus of the faculty's role in institutional decision-making is, of course, tenure. This is a link that I mentioned right at the top to just a number of association resources on academic freedom. And again, I'll send this presentation to Johnny afterward for him to share as he sees fit. I would also close by thanking you again for attending. And if you have a question, especially one that we don't have time to address during the Q&A over the next 25 minutes or so, or if you need assistance regarding academic freedom, tenure, or shared governance, please feel free to send an email message to our department. This is our kind of our group email. Either I or one of my colleagues will respond as promptly as we can. As you might imagine, we receive hundreds, probably over 1,000 inquiries and complaints every year, and we have a kind of a small staff in our department, but we do our best to reply within a week or so, if not sooner. So again, if you have a question, especially one that we're not able to address before 5 o'clock today, please send it along. And especially if you need assistance with anything that has to do with academic freedom, tenure, due process, or governance, please always feel free to send us an email message. And thank you again.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. That was terrific. And I mean, you covered so much ground there, and there are so many directions in which we could come at this. But looking at some of the Q&A that we've already received from audience members in advance, a few topics come to mind right away I'd like to address with you. The first one involves the number of places from which attacks on academic freedom might come. Because obviously, as you frame it, ultimately the concern is the relationship between faculty and administration, because administration is in the position to actually discipline faculty. But the pressure can be coming from lots of places. It can be coming from politicians. It can be coming from alums. It can be coming from powerful members of the community. It can be coming from students or other faculty members. And so One question I wanted to raise with you is, how do you think about the kinds of pressures that might be coming from groups of students who are unhappy with something that a professor either publishes or said in the classroom that is, unpopular or inflammatory?
For students specifically, from an AAUP policy perspective, which is how I come at everything, because our department is kind of the policy arm of the association. So the questions that I'll field will all be coming from that perspective. From a policy perspective, it doesn't make a huge difference in terms of where the pressure comes from or where the attacks on tenure and academic freedom come from, whether it's from students or alumni or administrators or politicians. What we always encourage faculty to do is kind of, act collectively to resist, and also to contact us when they feel their academic freedom has been threatened by whichever group. So that would be my practical advice to attendees today as well. It's absolutely true, as you suggested, Richard, that the attacks have proliferated, and they're coming from, some days it seems like they're coming from all sides, right? Some of the inquiries and complaints we get are like, really, now it's happening over here. It was always happening over there, but now it's over here too. The AAUP put together a joint task force back in, I guess it was back in October of last year, technically, but they didn't really start to work until January. It was a joint task force of our Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure and our Committee on College and University Government to address specifically what you just asked about, how to resist, specifically political interference in higher education, but also less explicitly other kinds of threats to academic freedom and tenure and governance. And one of the, a lot of the practical suggestions in the Joint Task Force's statement that it came up with are things like, invite your local legislators to campus so they can see what you actually do in the classroom, to try and disabuse them of some of the notions they might have about what faculty are actually doing. Go visit them in their offices and explain what you do. Connect with the local community and get out there and explain why the college or university is so important to the local community and what the connections are between them. And also using the classroom to educate students about the importance of tenure and academic freedom. When a faculty member feels like or perceives that students are coming after them, that's what we used to call a teachable moment. Maybe we still do. Use the classroom as an educational space to teach students about these things. 18, 19, 20-year-old college students typically have not thought about the policy statements that are in the AAUP Redbook, right? So use the classroom as a space to educate students about that aspect of their own education, why it's important that their professors have that freedom.
That's great, thanks. Another thing that occurs to me is the role of social media in all of this, because, again, although the direct threats to academic freedom come from administration, often the campaigns against people get revved up in social media, and one that puts pressure on the administration, but also, even if the administration doesn't respond, people can be targets of pretty vicious online campaigns, doxing, people, their home address being published, threats, as a result of a social media campaign. And it's a very different environment than it used to be before that became a factor.
Oh, absolutely. I'm definitely old enough to remember the time before that, and maybe you are too. But I think there are two different aspects to that comment. One is there is a statement in the Redbook that derives from the 1940 statement. It's on electronic communications and academic freedom. And essentially what that statement boils down to saying is that faculty are entitled to the same academic freedom in their online communications, email, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, as they are in a physical classroom. The same principles and standards apply. Maybe more importantly, and it goes to what you said right at the end there about doxing, we have a number of resources online. I think we call it some kind of toolkit for faculty members to utilize when they have been targeted, especially by kind of right-wing groups like Turning Point USA and Campus Reform. In fact, I think we have a toolkit specifically about Turning Point USA. You know, statements about how we expect the administration to respond in defense of that faculty member publicly, but also practical suggestions for what a faculty member can do once they have been targeted by one of these groups or by individuals online. Those are resources that we've had to share much more frequently than we would have ever liked to, even just over the last 3, 4, 5 years, but they are there on the AAUP's website.
Oh, good. Here, another question that comes to mind, some of the Q&A that I've gotten kind of in a variety of ways starts to get at this. There's some tough cases in which, because you mentioned that although academic freedom doesn't allow the professor to violate university policy, now we're in an environment in which, you know, university policies sometimes control or at least make suggestions about what people say on certain topics. So, you know, just to give you an example, there was the law professor Amy Wax, who said some, you know, frankly, in my view, quite appalling and racist comments. And as a consequence, the university disciplined her. Now, they didn't fire her, but they did discipline her. And there's debate about whether that counts as academic freedom or whether that was a legitimate response of the institution to a comment that, you know, students would understandably think meant she couldn't be fair in her assessment of their performance.
Yeah, and again, I think there are two important things in what you just said. The first, it goes back to our statement on professional ethics, which I just quickly opened up to, because what you said almost cites it, or cites it really well in a way. Although professors observe the stated regulations of the institution, provided the regulations do not contravene academic freedom, they maintain their right to criticize and seek revision. So there's that important clause in there that you kind of referenced. But also, in a case like Amy Wax or some of these other high-profile controversial cases that we've seen, the overriding principle from an AAUP policy perspective is that the faculty makes the judgment about whether one of their colleagues' academic freedom has been violated, whether they should be sanctioned in some way. So we're not, the AAUP is in a position, at least the members of our department are never in a position to judge whether somebody's academic freedom has been violated. What we do is judge whether our standards have been adhered to. Despite some belief to the contrary, we don't advocate for individual faculty members. Individual faculty members are not like our clients. Our clients, to the extent that we have one, are our standards and principles. That's what we advocate for. So if a professor were to come to us and say, my administration is seeking to dismiss me or has suspended me and is going to seek to dismiss me at the expiration of the suspension, our first question is always, okay, can you send us all the documentation you have so we can figure out whether the administration, in seeking a suspension or a dismissal or some other sanction, has adhered to our standards, namely, in the case of dismissal, Regulation 5, as I mentioned, you know, on one of the slides. In the case of determination of an appointment because of financial exigency, did they adhere to the standards set forth in Regulation 4C? So that's the way we always come at it. And if the administration has not adhered to those standards, we often find ourselves in a position to communicate with that administration formally in writing to say, here's our understanding of what happened. Here are what appear to be the relevant standards. Let's try and reach some kind of resolution here that comports with those standards. When an administration has actually adhered to those standards, there's very little for us to, there's little basis for us to intervene in that situation, because again, we're looking at violations of our standards and principles, above and beyond anything else.
Great. Another issue, and I was really happy you mentioned this in your talk as well, that often people don't think of when they think about academic freedom, has to do with university governance. So, not only the faculty governance is a key component as opposed to only administrators, but I wonder whether you have any thoughts about what seems to me to be a growing trend toward, kind of corporatization of university administration, that, from what I've seen anecdotally, increasingly people in administration are coming from outside the academy, and they're bringing in the kind of management skills that you would typically apply in, other businesses where ideas like academic freedom don't exist. And as a consequence, those kind of management skills are at odds with the values of academic freedom, and yet they're becoming more pervasive.
Yeah, it's been a problem. It's been a trend for some time now, and in fact, there was a great book. It's probably 8 or 10 years old now, maybe not that old, but it's getting up there. Called "The Fall of the Faculty" by Benjamin Ginsberg, and it documents exactly the trend that you asked about. It's the corporatization of the academy has been a trend for some time, and the appointment of administrators who come, especially presidents and also board members, whose experiences in the corporate world is has also been a trend for some time. It's our standards, our governance standards, call for the president in particular of any institution to serve a dual role. The Statement on Government of Colleges and Universities, which the AAUP jointly formulated with the American Council on Education, which represents presidents, and the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges, which obviously represents governing boards. This joint formulation of those three, which is, came out in the 60s, says that president should serve the dual role of chief academic officer of the institution and the faculty, and chief executive officer of the board. So when you have a president who has little to no academic credentials, little to no academic experience, and most or all of the experience comes from the business world, I would imagine it would be very difficult for that president to serve effectively as a chief academic officer of a college or university and of its faculty. I guess the example that comes immediately to mind is Bruce Harreld, who was appointed the president of the University of Iowa in 2014, 2015, after what was exposed to be a kind of a sham search, right? He was the inside candidate all along. He had spent his career at IBM as an executive. He had no administrative experience, no academic experience, and yet here he found himself as the president of a major research university. And as you can all imagine, it did not go well, right? So whether it's Bruce Harreld or Sonny Perdue, or you can kind of pick and choose now because it's so common, as you suggested, Richard, appointments like that are not consistent with the standards that we jointly recommended in 1967 with the ACE and the AGB. And those standards and principles still apply very much, maybe even more so now than then.
Another question that's related to this that several people asked has to do with non-tenured faculty. And you mentioned that there are a growing number of non-tenured faculty and a shrinking number of tenured faculty. That's kind of related to the corporatization of administration, because of course, from a corporate perspective, it might seem to make sense to hire people that you can get to do the same or similar work for cheaper. and that don't get the protections of tenure. But what can be done about that, or what is your organization trying to do about that trend?
We've been trying to fight it for a long time, primarily through, again, our policy standards and principles. To this day, the AAUP only recognizes two types of faculty appointments: those that are eligible for tenure and those that are tenured, continuously tenured appointments. That's it. We recognize, of course, that in reality, there are a bunch of other types of appointments, including part-time and full-time non-tenure track. But we've stuck to this recognition of only these two, in part to emphasize the importance of tenure in protecting academic freedom. And so what that means in practice is, like, for example, when we're contacted by a faculty member who has been a full-time faculty member at their institution for more than 7 years, which is the probationary period recommended in the 1940 statement. They've been non-tenure track, part-time, full-time, doesn't matter. If they've been, full-time. If they've been there for more than 7 full-time years and they don't have tenure, under our standards, they have what we refer to as de facto tenure. And by having de facto tenure, under our standards, they're entitled to all the same protections, due process protections, that an actual tenured faculty member is: an adjudicative hearing of record before an elected faculty body, where the administration bears the burden of demonstrating cause for dismissal or suspension or whatever. That's the kind of the policy part of it. Practically, well, let me stick with the policy just for another couple seconds. We also have advocated, the AAUP has advocated for quite some time, for the full participation of part-time faculty and other non-tenure track faculty in the governance of the institution. One faculty member, one vote, regardless of your status as full-time, part-time, tenured, tenure track, non-tenure track. It doesn't matter under our standards. Non-tenure track faculty should have all the same rights and responsibilities in terms of governance that tenure track and tenured faculty members have. And that's where governance is tied up with academic freedom again, inextricably linked, involving more part-time faculty members in governance because they do the same work as tenured and tenure track members, so they should be entitled to it. Also, ultimately, we believe will serve to protect not only their academic freedom, but everyone's. And it's, I would also argue, just practically, it's incumbent on those faculty members who enjoy tenure, and I was one of them for a long time, to protect the academic freedom of their more vulnerable colleagues. And there are a number of ways they can do that, including by supporting their participation in the governance of the institution. Does that?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Let's see, we've only got about 5 minutes left, and I've got one other kind of category of questions that we could touch on, which has to do with history. Because we were talking a little bit earlier about the way that these kinds of censorship movements, these attacks on academic freedom, seem to come back like a disease that's dormant, and then it resurfaces. And we're now in a moment where it's coming back. But one person asked, for instance, how does this compare to what happened under McCarthyism? And I wonder if you have any other historical examples that are comparable to what's happening right now.
The closest probably is McCarthyism. I mean, as I said earlier, our special committee on Florida called this an unparalleled attack on unparalleled political interference in U.S. history, and I would tend to agree with that. I was not alive during McCarthyism, but from what I've read about it, that period, that would probably be the closest approximation. Although my sense is that we are in, I want to say we're in a darker time now, but I'm not sure darker is the right term. It's a little too loaded. I want to say we're in a much more dangerous time because there seems to be a concerted effort to undermine values that we have long held dear in the academy. including tenure and academic freedom, but also things like, the accreditation process. Like, we now have at least 2 presidential candidates who have gone on record publicly as questioning the legitimacy of accrediting agencies in this country, the very agencies that are responsible for maintaining the academic quality of colleges and universities. And it appears to many of us that publicly questioning their legitimacy is, at least in part, a response to the fact that they are in place to protect things like tenure and the faculty's role in governance and academic freedom from those who want to do away with those things for political or ideological reasons. So when we're even seeing attacks on accrediting agencies, which, to be frank, they're pretty benign organizations historically, that marks a significant difference. I think we're in a significantly different period. But if I had to compare it to something, it would be, as one of the attendees suggested, McCarthyism.
Wow, so maybe even worse than McCarthyism from the perspective of the academy, because now we're seeing an attack on the very character of higher education. That a lot of this seems to be a concentrated attack on higher ed generally.
Yeah, and into the nooks and crannies of it too, like accrediting, like the faculty's role in hiring faculty members. I mean, we've seen bills in legislatures across the country that have sought to give, like, presidents or their administrative designees sole authority to hire faculty members and not binding them even to a faculty recommendation. When we're seeing politicians remake governing boards for political and ideological reasons, that trickles down. By all accounts, New College of Florida is in chaos right now. There aren't enough dorm rooms. There's a huge influx of athletes for reasons, that are probably beyond the scope of this webinar. But it's like into the nooks and crannies in a way that I have not seen before, that I can't imagine it was during McCarthyism. That was more an attack on, what do these faculty members believe? And if we believe they believe something we think they shouldn't believe, we want them out. This is much more expansive, or at least it seems to be.
Right. It's an attack on the whole enterprise.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Well, it looks like we're out of time. This was such a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard, for moderating. It's been a pleasure.